Since the 1950s, European integration has seen the development of a supranational system of governance, as its institutions move further from the concept of simple intergovernmentalism and more towards a federalized system. However, with the Maastricht Treaty of 1992, new intergovernmental elements have been introduced alongside the more federal systems, making it more difficult to define the European Union. The European Union, which operates through a hybrid system of intergovernmentalism and supranationalism, is not officially a federation, though various academic observers regard it as having the characteristics of a federal system. History. In the Congress of Aix-la-Chapelle of 1818, Tsar Alexander, as the most advanced internationalist of the day, suggested a kind of permanent European Union and even proposed the maintenance of international military forces to provide recognized states with support against changes by violence. A pan-European movement gained some momentum from the 1920s with the creation of the Pan-European Union, based on Richard Nicolaus von Coudenhove-Kaller's 1923 Manifesto Pan-Europa, which presented the idea of a unified European state. This movement, led by Coudenhove-Kalergi and subsequently by Otto von Habsburg, is the oldest European unification movement. His ideas influenced Aristide Briand, who gave a speech in favor of a European Union in the League of Nations on 8 September 1929, and in 1930, who wrote his memorandum on the organization of a regime of European Federal Union for the government of France. At the end of World War II, the political climate favored unity in Western Europe, seen by many as an escape from the extreme forms of nationalism which had devastated the continent. In a speech delivered on 9 September 1946 at the University of Zurich, Switzerland, Winston Churchill postulated a United States of Europe. One of the first practical and successful proposals for European cooperation came in 1951 with the European Coal and Steel Community. Since then, the European Community has gradually evolved to a union in which a whole range of policy areas where its member states hope to benefit from working together. The process of intergovernmentally pooling powers, harmonizing national policies and creating and enforcing supranational institutions, is called European integration. Other than the vague aim of ever closer union in the 1983 Solemn Declaration on European Union, the Union has no current policy to create a federal state. Debate on European unity is often vague as to the boundaries of Europe. The word Europe is widely used as a synonym for the European Union, although most of the European continent's geographical area is not in the EU, and some of the EU is outside of Europe. Most of Europe's people do, however, live in the EU. Multi-speed integration. The multi-speed Europe thesis envisions an alternative type of European integration, where the EU countries that want a more integrated EU can accelerate their own integration, whereas other countries may go at a slower pace or cease further integration altogether. Specific current examples include the Eurozone and the Schengen area, which not all members have elected to join. Present situation. The European Union is not de jure a federation, but various academics have argued that it contains some federal characteristics. Here is the view of Professor R. Daniel Kuhlmann on how various brands of scholars approach the issue, unencumbered by the prejudice that the EU is sui generis and incomparable. Federalism scholars now regularly treat the EU as a case in their comparative studies. For the purposes of the present analysis, the EU has the necessary minimal attributes of a federal system, and crucially the EU is riven with many of the same tensions that afflict federal systems. According to Joseph H. Weiler, Europe has charted its own brand of constitutional federalism. Jean-Michel Jocelyn and Alain Marchiano see the European Court of Justice as being a primary force behind building a federal legal order in the Union, with Jocelyn stating that a complete shift from a confederation to a federation would have required to straightforwardly replace the principality of the member states vis-à-vis the Union by that of the European citizens. As a consequence, both confederate and federate features coexist in the judicial landscape. According to Thomas Rees and Tanya Borzil, the EU only lacks two significant features of a federation. First, the member states remain the masters of the treaties, i.e., they have the exclusive power to amend or change the constitutive treaties of the EU. Second, the EU lacks a real tax and spend capacity. In other words, there is no fiscal federalism. Other academics have argued that the EU is unlikely to evolve into a unified federal state. Glentamara has taken this view himself, arguing that limits placed on the bureaucratic capacity of the European institutions, such as the relatively small size of the European Commission, form a barrier to the creation of a federal European state. In the words, widespread political opposition to the creation of anything approximating a large, unified executive bureaucracy in Brussels has long since ended hopes, for the few who harbored them, of creating a European superstate. Quote, some common points in this context are that the European budget is very small and does not finance a lot of the economic activity of the European Union, that each member state of the European Union has its own foreign relations and has its own military if it so desires, that it is often the case that European Union member states decide to opt out of agreements which they oppose, and that member states still retain sovereignty over a large number of areas which might be expected to be transferred to a federal authority under a federal system. One important fact is that treaties must be agreed by all member states, even if a particular treaty has support among the vast majority of the population of the European Union. Member states may also want legally binding guarantees that a particular treaty will not affect a nation's position on certain issues. Use of the word federal is itself the cause of some disagreement. Valéry Giscard d'Estaing found opposition from the United Kingdom towards including the word federal in the European Constitution, and hence replaced the word with community. Leo Klinkers and Herbert Toomer explain in the European Federalist Papers the elementary standards and principles of federalism. They depict the system errors of the Treaty of Lisbon, which forms the legal basis of the present intergovernmentalist governance of the EU. They argue that this intergovernmental system, driven by state national interests, should be substituted for a European federation. This involves an institutional shift, and evolution step by step towards a federation is senseless, as the past 70 years demonstrate. In line with Montesquieu, they advocate that a federal organization has a specific advantage. It combines the strong cohesion of small communities and the force of large ones. Klinkers and Toomer emphasize that a European federation has nothing to do with the so-called European integration. Integration means complete mixing. Federalism entails a sharing of guaranteed autonomy, i.e., sovereignty, between each component of the federation and the federal whole. A federal pact and law is the safeguard of the federation. In this case, a European federal constitution. Therefore, the European Federalist Papers conclude with a draft federal constitution of only 10 articles, drawing on the 1787–89 American Constitution, as well as on the 1848 Swiss Constitution. Constitutions creating federations which stand firm until today. Klinkers and Toomer set out why a European federation is feasible. Federations emerge from common values and interests. Europeans share the rule of law, equality under the law, non-violence, a connected heritage and a specific geopolitical position. Moreover, its cultural diversity is not a burden, like the American, Indian and Swiss federations show. An example of the mind-setting different from many Europeans. For Swiss people, the acceptance of diversity is a prerequisite for unity. Polls. According to Eurobarometer, 69% of EU citizens are in favor of direct elections of the President of the European Commission. 46% support the creation of a united EU army. Two-thirds of respondents think that the EU should make decisions on foreign policy. More than half of respondents think that the EU should also make decisions on defense. 44% of respondents support the future development of the European Union as a federation of nation-states. 35% are opposed. The Nordic countries were the most negative of a united Europe in this study. 73% of the Nordics opposed the idea. A large majority of the people for whom the EU conjures up a positive image support the further development of the EU into a federation of nation-states.